Hello everyone, and welcome back to our study of the Old Testament book of Hosea. This is a part of our entire study of the three minor prophets which coincide with the major prophet Isaiah. We previously studied Amos, we're currently studying Hosea, and we will soon get into the book of Micah. In our previous lessons on the book of Hosea, we noticed that the book begins by giving us a picture of God's relationship with the nation of Israel, and by the nation of Israel, we're talking about those 10 northern tribes that after the division of the kingdom went off under the leadership of Jeroboam I. And Hosea depicts the relationship that God now has with Israel by sending Hosea out to take a wife of prostitution, a woman by the name of Gomer. And she leaves Hosea, goes back to prostitution, prostitutes herself to perhaps multiple men, at least multiple men. 3 children are born, and it's indicated that at least 2 of those children probably did not belong to Hosea. And so that's the beginning of the book. In the next section of the book, chapters 4 through 6 that we looked at last week, that relationship is solidified so far as the picture between what happened with Hosea and Gomer and that which was going on with Israel. And we continue our study of the latter half, or the latter section of the book, really more than half, in chapter 7. And as we pick up tonight, coming out of chapter 6, we notice that Hosea pointed out that Israel had tried to get back in the graces of God by some brief religious revival, but it was very brief, and certainly, and later in the text would indicate that it wasn't even genuine on the part of many. In Hosea chapter 6 and verse 4, Hosea points out that it was like a morning cloud, like a mist or a fog, that as soon as the sun comes up, everything that is remaining of it disappears. That whole concept is continued in chapter 7 as Hosea gives us some other terms to indicate the fleeting faithfulness of Israel. In chapter 7 and verse 8, we have Israel as a cake half-baked. In chapter 7 and verse 9, we find Israel described as a gray-haired individual, one who's nearing the end of their life, one who has already served their greatest strength and use. In chapter 7 and verse 11, they're described as a silly dove that flits here and there. And in chapter 7 and verse 16, they're even described as a deceitful bow. And we'll talk a little bit more about those pictures and the context that surrounds those pictures here in just a moment. One of the things that we find here in chapter 7, and I really throughout the entire book, that I think is significant for us to point out, that is that Hosea uses terminology that is interchangeable in reference to these northern tribes and the nation of Israel as it existed in his time. He refers to Israel, the nation itself. He refers to Ephraim, which was the largest tribe of the 10, and scholars tell us most likely it was also the ruling tribe. As Ephraim went, so went the rest of the nation. And then he also uses Samaria, which was the capital city. And much as we would describe the United States maybe by using a depiction of Washington, Washington, D.C., or if we're talking about entertainment concepts, we talk about it being Hollywood, a movie or a television program. It may have been filmed any number of places throughout the country or even in another country, and yet we refer to it as being Hollywood. And so Hosea uses the term Samaria much in that way. So he talks about Israel or Ephraim or Samaria, but these terms are used interchangeably. In chapter 7 and verse 4, he reasserts the spiritual adultery idea and concept that he had so often earlier in the book, and is, as we stated, the very basis of the book and the relationship between Hosea and Gomer. In chapter 7 and verse 4, we read, they are all adulterers. They are like a heated oven whose baker ceases to stir the fire from the kneading of dough until it is leavened. So their adultery, their spiritual adultery, had come into full flame. And there was no questioning or no doubt of the condition of the people, as Hosea would describe these things in the following chapters. In addition to their moral corruptness that he details in chapters 4 through 6, in chapter 7 he alerts us to not only their moral corruptness, but their political corruptness, which shows itself in the way that they interrelated with their surrounding nations. We would call it today foreign policy. Particularly Egypt and Assyria are asserted, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the next few chapters. But in chapter 7, he describes their fleeting faithfulness in the terms that we described earlier, and as it relates to the way that they dealt with the nations around them. In chapter 7 and verse 8, when he talks about them being a cake half baked, they were well, if you've ever cooked or tried to bake a cake or something of that nature in an oven that was not working right, maybe the element was not working properly, the heat was off for one reason or another, you may get a cake that is done, maybe even charred on one side, but it's still undone on the other side, maybe on top. It looks like it's good, you cut into it and the dough just, or the batter just kind of runs. And that's the picture that Hosea is giving of Israel at this particular point. And in essence, he's saying you're hot toward your neighbors, your political neighbors, your geographic neighbors, but you're raw or undone so far as God is concerned. And that's the concept that is involved in that particular description. They had lost the strength of their youth. Israel was once a vibrant nation. They were once a strong nation. They were once a nation that was feared by their neighbors. Now they were laughed at. They were mocked. They were even ridiculed. They became an annoyance in some ways. And so the strength they had in their youth had begun to wane. So he describes that by talking about the gray hairs in verse 9. Many of us can sympathize with the fact that as we grow older, we just can't do some of the things that we once did earlier on in our lives. Our strength is not what it used to be. Our flexibility is not what it used to be. Our endurance is not what it used to be. And so we understand that as gray hairs begin to form around the temples, perhaps all over the head, as mine obviously is, then we just don't perform physically as well as we used to. And that's the concept that he employs here. In verse 11, as he talks about a silly dove flitting here or there. If you've ever seen a dove where there may be small collections of water or pools of water in a field or on a parking lot or something of that nature, they may go to one and they spread their wings and flap them to cool off or to wash their wings. Then they go to the other one. They may drink a little bit of the water and then they flit to another one. Israel was constantly doing that with their neighbors, trying to find one political ally after another political ally, or one military ally to protect them from another military ally that had now turned an enemy. And so they were flitting here or there, just like a silly dove. And then the concept in chapter 7 and verse 16 of a deceitful bow, they were, though they feigned their devotion toward God and their desire to serve God, we find that it just never really stuck. And if you've ever shot a rifle or a pistol, or even if you're a bow hunter and something is off with the sights, you think you're aiming in the right direction, you think you're doing the right thing, but as you fire, you find that it's going to go a little to the right or a little to the left, maybe a little high, maybe a little low. And Israel thought in these little approaches to God that somehow they were doing the right thing, somehow they would appease God, and He would just keep going along with them. But they were constantly missing the mark, and it was becoming very annoying and tiring even to God. As we turn to chapter 8 could be titled The Inevitable Judgment, because as he discusses these things, he then wants them to understand judgment is here, as we talked about in the book of Amos. Amos 4 and verse 12, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. Here in Hosea chapter 8 and verse 1, he tells the people, the trumpet is at the lips. The vulture is circling overhead. Now, some of your translations may say the eagle is circling, or the eagle is flying about. A difference a little bit in translations. Personally, I think the concept of a vulture probably is more picturesque to us. I can remember growing up in Florida, one summer I was working with my dad, who was in construction, and he was working a job that was about 30, 40, maybe even 50 miles away from our home, and we would travel about almost an hour to get there in the morning. In the afternoon, in the heat of the day, we'd be traveling back, and we traveled down a long 2-lane road that for some stretches there was nothing. There were no houses, no stores, just nothing there but woods. And occasionally you'd come upon a dead carcass. Somebody had run over something, and it was lying there either on the pavement or to the side of the pavement. And you could look up and you could see the vultures circling. And all they were waiting for was the traffic to die down. Any traffic that might have been on the road. As soon as it was clear, as soon as they felt like they could swoop in and pick the carcass, then that's exactly what they were going to do. And that's the picture Hosea uses here at the beginning of chapter 8 to indicate that God's ready to swoop in, or at least God's ready to allow your enemies to swoop in and take judgment upon you. Another theme in chapter 8 that is significant for us to notice, beginning in verse 4, Hosea notes that as God looked down upon them and God dealt with them, he says, they made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. Now, again, this is not indicative of the fact that there was something going on in Israel God just didn't know. But the people were doing something that God never really desired. 1 Samuel chapter 8, and this takes us back to the beginning even of the monarchy in Israel. You remember Samuel was kind of put out and down in the mouth because the people came and said, we want a king like the nations around us. Samuel thought they had rejected him. God says, Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. I'm their king. Samuel was a prophet. Samuel was a judge, but Samuel was no king. God said, I'm their king. And it's me that they're rejecting. And you may remember there in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God sends Samuel back to the people and says, okay, you want a king, I'll give you a king. But I want you to understand what's going to happen here. This king's going to abuse you. He's going to take advantage of you. He's going to lead you down the wrong path. And when all of this happens, I want you to know that you've been warned ahead of time. Well, Hosea is reminding them a little bit here that God tried to tell them what was going to go on and what was going to happen. And God says, you set up your kings. You wanted a king, I gave you a king. Now, as Paul says in Acts 17 on the Areopagus, and again reiterates the same concept in Romans chapter 13, God ordains civil leaders, and he appoints their times and their habitations. So these kings didn't come to power. Jeroboam the first or any of the other kings of Israel, they didn't come to power without God having a hand in it. But what Hosea wants them to understand is that this was not God's original plan. This was not what God desired for them. So he tells them in verse 7, since you've sown to the wind, now you reap the whirlwind. The results or the circumstances or the consequences rather. The consequences of our actions are often much worse than we could have realized when we went into that circumstance, and maybe much worse than we really want in the end. But nonetheless, we have to deal with the consequences. Now, under these kings, Israel had multiplied their altars. I think this really is talking about in a couple of different ways as we move on through chapter 8. They multiplied their altars both in numbers and in gods. Now Jeroboam the first, as we mentioned before, he set up places for them to worship God, Jehovah, in Bethel and in Mount Gerizim, so that they didn't have to go back to Jerusalem. He didn't want to lose them to Jerusalem, to some nostalgic idea that they, or even a restoration idea. Hey, it's not right to worship here. We're going to go back to Jerusalem and worship. He didn't want to lose them to that, so he set up those places in Bethel and in Mount Gerizim. And but in addition to that, there were multiple places throughout the northern tribes where the false gods, the Baals and so forth, of their neighboring countries and their neighboring peoples, as they gave in to the idolatry, they set up places of worship all over the countryside. And so they multiplied not only the altars, but they multiplied as well the gods that they were worshiping by those altars. Now, verse 12 of chapter 8 is reminiscent of a statement you've heard many times, and that is, you can't legislate morality. And God essentially says, you knew it was wrong. There are plenty of laws against idolatry, but I could write 10,000 laws and it wouldn't do any good with you. I mean, their departure from God was full and complete. And it says all the laws in the world aren't going to change a single thing so far as you are concerned with these idols. And so the sacrifices they made to God had come to mean nothing. And that's what he tells them in verse 13. They indeed had forgotten their Maker, as he says in verse 14. This is somewhat reminiscent of Romans chapter 1, having exchanged the Creator for the creature. And God gives them up until there's a certain point where, verse 28, I believe he says, they simply didn't acknowledge God. And Israel had come to that point. When we come into chapter 9 then, we see a little bit of a revival, probably an economic revival at this particular point. But again, remember the background of the book. Hosea goes and takes a wife of prostitution, Gomer. Now, imagine, if you will, Gomer comes home to Hosea on any number of occasions, and Hosea is heartbroken. He's wrenched. He wants to know why she's doing this, and she's got a smile on her face. She said, "But look, Hosea, look at this money. Look at the goods. Look at what I'm bringing home." And she almost rejoices in the fact that she's doing the things that she's doing, because look at the prosperity that we enjoy as a result. Israel was enjoying prosperity, and so they didn't think there was anything wrong. They thought everything was going fine. But Hosea warns them here in chapter 9 and verse 1, do not rejoice. Don't take any joy in what's going on. Don't take any comfort in the fact that things seem to be going well now, because he said there's a return to Egypt coming. Verse 2. Now, this return to Egypt is not a literal return to Egypt, because they had already put off Egypt. Egypt was not an ally at this point, and neither was Egypt interested in conquering this particular region of the world and taking these particular people. If Egypt was going to go after anybody, it was going to be their southern brethren, that being Judah. And so he alerts them. This is just kind of a symbolic language to remind them of their bondage. Now, they were fully aware of the bondage that their forefathers had suffered, but although they were aware of it, it just didn't seem to hold the same importance in their minds. And so they had drifted away from God. They had forgotten what God had done for their forefathers in previous generations. And now they were about to wind up in the same condition. This time not to Egypt, but he goes on in verse 2 to talk about the unclean food of Assyria. So he names who it is. Here's an interesting thing. At this particular point, they thought Assyria was their friend. They thought Assyria was an ally. But he says Assyria is going to come in. Assyria is really going to do a number on you. And you will be eating their food, their unclean food, and it will not be pleasant. Earlier in the book, the priests were indicted because they had not taught the people the Word of God, the law of God. And as a result, the people had departed. Here in chapter 9, he turns the focus to the prophets. As the priests had not taught them the law of God, many of the prophets simply had not told them what God truly desires from them. Look, if you will, in verses 7 through 9. The days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The man of the Spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. And so men like Hosea, who would come in and tell them exactly what God wanted them to know and be very clear about it, the people, they looked at him as if he was a madman, as if he was a fool, because of what so many of the other prophets had done. When we read through our Bibles in the history books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we read of many great prophets of Israel. We also read of the major prophets and the minor prophets, and these men were faithful prophets to God. They accomplished what God wanted them to accomplish. But as many men as there were that were faithful to God, there were multiplied dozens, maybe hundreds, who were like the people that Paul describes in 2 Timothy chapter 4, that when the people had itching ears, they were the ones to scratch them. And so there were a lot of false prophets, a lot of deceptive prophets that simply did not instruct the people in the way of God. Beginning in verse 10 of chapter 9, the prophet reflects back upon the early days of Israel and how they had come along to corrupt themselves with Baal Peor, one of the gods of their neighbors. A person becomes like what he worships, he tells us in the latter part of verse 10. Now here's an interesting theological and I guess anthropological concept. Anthropology, the study of mankind, tells us that a lot of ancient societies who believed in multiple gods, they made gods out of some of their less appealing characteristics. Many of their vices became gods. There were gods of sex and gods of drinking and things of that nature. Some ancient societies had, well, you recall when the Ark of the Covenant was carried into the land of the Philistines, and they placed it there in this little house, and around it was the gods of the Philistines. One was a hemorrhoid. It was a statue of a hemorrhoid. Imagine that. But nonetheless, they had made that a god. Other societies had gods of feces. So this was not to be a god or to become a god wasn't necessarily, it wasn't all Zeus and Apollo and those types of things. Many times it was very, very degrading of the people, and one of the cautions that the Old Testament gives, both in the Psalms and here in Hosea chapter 9, is you become like what you worship. And so if we give ourselves over to material things and to sexual pursuits, to the mundane and the material and things that are temporary, we will become more like that rather than becoming more like God. So the answer is to worship God and to become like Him. Their fruitfulness was exchanged for barrenness. What they once accomplished, they could not accomplish and did not accomplish because they had given over to these false gods. You remember in 1 Kings 18 when Elijah challenged the 450 prophets of Baal, and they called and they cried, and their God did not light the fire to make the sacrifice, and Elijah chided them. Maybe he's taking a nap. Maybe he's on vacation. All of these things could be taking place, and so he's just not answering you right now. When it came Elijah's turn, they doused it with water. They filled a trench with water around it. They made it almost impossible for a fire to start, and yet God made a fire start. But the people would follow the 450 prophets before they would follow Elijah. They exchanged their fruitfulness for barrenness. Now, among the Jewish concept, barrenness was not a good thing. Barrenness was a sign of divine disfavor. And so it's interesting in verse 14 that Hosea even asked the question, "Give them, O Lord, what will you give them?" And he answers his own question as he goes through the verse. He says, "Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts." So in other words, he says, here's what they're suitable for. Here's what they need. They need barrenness and they need dryness. So not only would they not be able to produce, but once they produce, they wouldn't be able to feed. And he said that is what they are fit for. He speaks of Gilgal in the following verses, and Gilgal had been a scene of many blessings for the people. When they came across the Jordan, they came into Gilgal, and altars were built there. We read of Gilgal again in 1 Samuel 11. Micah even mentions Gilgal in his prophecy. And so a lot of good things had happened there, but verse 15 tells us that it is also the center of their evil. A lot of times places that have done so much good, when they become the center rather than pointing toward the one who actually accomplishes the good, and that being God, then a lot more evil comes out of that place than good. And such was the case with Gilgal. And so they were rejected because they did not listen to God, according to verse 17. Again, reminiscent of what we learn in the New Testament of Romans chapter 1, exchanging the knowledge of God. They didn't know God, they didn't understand God, they didn't listen to God. And this was the real reason they were going to be punished and carried away. In chapter 10 could probably be described as a luxuriant vine. He comes back to this concept and this idea of what they used to be or what they could have been had they remained faithful to God. But as they're carried away into captivity, Hosea says, the false gods that you've relied on, the false gods that you've built for yourselves, they're going to be carried away too, and they're going to be carried away as a tribute to the king of Assyria. And so he uses a phrase that we come upon later in the Bible as well. He says, their glory had become their shame. And he repeats this again, or he stated it earlier in chapter 4 and verse 7. And in the New Testament, we find that as Paul appeals to the Philippians and some who had chased after false doctrine, he speaks of those false teachers. He says, their end is destruction, their God is their belly, their glory is their shame, their minds are set on earthly things. We better be careful what we glory in, what we set our minds on. Because sometimes those very things that we think are glorious are and can be very, very shameful to us as well. You look in our society and so many things that our society glories in. Today, people are up in arms and just excited about the fact that some states are allowing same-sex marriage and homosexual rights, and the news is focused on Bruce Jenner transgendering into a woman. And this is what's on the news. This is what entertains people. This is what seems to attract a lot of minds and a lot of attention. And yet these things are at best shameful. And so we better be careful that our glory does not become our shame. Their destruction, he says, will be so immense that they will cry for the hills to cover them. Yet there will be no covering. Revelation chapter 6 I've always found to be an interesting chapter, because there we see a judgment scene depicted as well, and the people running into the caves, calling on the hills and the mountains to cover them, but there was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to hide from the judgment of God. And though they would call for the hills, though they would call for a covering, Hosea is essentially telling them there's not going to be a place you can get away from this. This will be a total and complete destruction. And so the people were going to suffer this great destruction no matter where they went, no matter what they attempted to cover themselves. Verse 12 is another call for repentance. He talks about them sowing righteousness. He talks about them breaking up their fallow ground. In order to reap something, you have to sow it. So it makes sense that he tells them to sow righteousness. The only way they were going to put off any type of punishment was to be righteous. But they had to sow righteousness in order to be righteous. And that was something that was beyond them. You reap what you sow. As he had said earlier, they had sown to the wind, they were now reaping the whirlwind. And it was not going to be pleasant. To break up their fallow ground, fallow is untilled, uncultivated ground. They would literally have to almost reinvent themselves in order to make it possible that this judgment would not come upon them. And then in verses 13 and 14, he goes on to make clear that the only plowing and sowing and cultivating they knew how to do was out of their own pride and their own strength and out of their own wickedness. And he says that just is not going to get it so far as God is concerned. Chapter 11 is the final chapter that we'll discuss tonight, and it's not a lengthy chapter, but it's an interesting chapter because we come back to that idea, Hosea and Gomer, a man who loves a woman, though the woman just kept going away from him and joining herself to wicked men. And so chapter 11, the basic theme of the chapter is God still loves you. No matter how corrupt they had become, no matter how bad things were, God still loved them. The whole vision, the whole prophecy of Hosea is built on the most distorted love story you can think of. And I say love story with quotes around it. But no matter how many times God had called to the people, no matter how many times Hosea went and brought Gomer back, Gomer goes out and she commits her prostitution again. No matter how many times God had called the people of Israel back, no matter how many times he had tried to save them, they would go back to their false gods and to their political and military lovers as they are described in this book. And God had not been harsh to them. He had only been loving to them. Chapter 11 and verse 4 tells us God's ways are not difficult. God's ways are not heavy. They're not burdensome. John tells us in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11. Yet because of their spirit of ingratitude, they could not grasp what God had done for them. They could not respond in a proper way. He tells us in verses 5 and following, they were going to go away. As we've said before, they would never be heard from again as a nation. They were just going to disappear because they could not respond in an appropriate way to the goodness and the grace and the mercy of God. The pain of judgment and his compassion upon his people is depicted for us ever so vividly in verses 8 through 12. People who have the concept that God punishes or that God must be some terrible person to punish someone. How many times have you heard people say, well, there can't be a hell where there's eternal punishment. God's too loving to do something like that. Well, the book of Hosea is for them. They need to take a look particularly at chapter 11. Look at the pain that Hosea describes that is in the mind and the heart of God as he looks down upon his people. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. It wasn't God's desire that they be destroyed. It wasn't God's greatest desire that they go into captivity and disappear. But it was precisely because God loved them that these things had to happen. God's judgment was not out of hatred. It was not out of detachment, but it was out of his supreme love for them. Next week we'll pick up with chapter 12. We'll take a look at 12, 13, and 14, a brief closing to the book, and then some introductory remarks for the book of Micah as we go into the next section of our study. Thank you and have a great evening.